Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Scott. Thank you for attending our Digital Harlem River History Walk today. Originally, this walk was planned as an in-person event along the Harlem River this past April. However, due to COVID-19, we had to cancel that walk. But being online not only allows us to learn this history at a safe distance, but it's also allowed us to accommodate many more people. And we've had 200 people register for this event. A number of you wrote to me describing the range of your interest in this walk. Whether as scientists, river residents, historians, or environmental activists, trying to document your own river's history on the Harlem River or elsewhere in the country. This evening, we will learn about the history of the Harlem River and consider the ways in which the river has been disconnected from its community and what can be done to reconnect with the river. But I also hope that it will clarify the value of river history more generally. If there's one thing that this pandemic has made clear, it's the way that the virus has exacerbated inequalities in our country. Rivers similarly provide a reflection of America's past and present history of inequality, while also offering up plenty of surprises in the ways people relate to their rivers. Okay, so I'm going to introduce everyone and explain how this walk is going to work today. As I said, I'm Scot McFarlane. I'm in the process of completing my PhD at Columbia University, where I'm writing my dissertation on Texas' Trinity River, bringing together environmental history and the history of slavery. Last fall, I had the chance to teach my own course in the history department at Columbia, Rivers, Politics, and Power in the US. My students and I explored a range of themes such as borders, environmentalism, or resilience, but we also used Columbia's location in Manhattan to explore and compare the Hudson and Harlem rivers. We canoed on the Harlem River, we went on the Circle Line tour, but the highlight was our walk along the river with Dwayne Bailey-Castro. Dwayne helped us to see the river from a new perspective and consider the ways that limited access to the river shaped the way the river was represented through photography. Dwayne is an urban landscape and travel photographer and a middle school social studies teacher. He is a lifelong Bronx resident. The main focus of his photographic work has been the Harlem River bridges, both as structures and symbols that offer a revealing and long overdue portrait of the communities and landscapes they connect. He has also traveled abroad extensively to countries including Bolivia, Cambodia, Cuba, Iceland, and India, seeking out images of natural, architectural, and historical interest. His work has been exhibited at a number of local venues, including the Morris Park New York Public Library, the New York City Parks Poe Park Visitor Center, Montefiore Medical Center, the Bronx Documentary Center, and the Bronx Historical Society. My students were also introduced to Nathan Kensinger through his articles on the often obscured and surprising history of New York City's waterways. Nathan is an interdisciplinary artist whose work explores hidden urban landscapes, including off-limit industrial structures, unnatural waterways, and coastal communities endangered by sea level rise. His work encompasses photography, film, installation, curation, and writing. For the last 15 years, he has been documenting New York City's changing waterfront in a series of photo essays, documentary films, and public art installations. His photographs have been exhibited by the Museum of the City of New York, the Brooklyn Museum, the Queens Museum, and the Museum of Contemporary African Diaspora and Arts. His work has been featured by the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, PBS NewsHour, Wired, and Nature Climate Change. Thank you so much, Nathan and Dwayne, for being willing to participate today. In addition, I'd also like to thank Kazan, who helped ensure that this event runs smoothly, my river history students, the Bronx Council on Environmental Quality, the Center for Science and Society, and the SOF Heyman Center for funding and sponsoring this event today. Before I continue, I do want to highlight two groups that are working on the Harlem River today. The first is South Bronx Unite, that's focused on the Port Morris Mont Haven neighborhood, and has been fighting to open the river and create green space in a part of the city with particularly limited access and high rates of asthma from air pollution. The other group is the Bronx Council on Environmental Quality, BCEQ. They are also part of the Harlem River Working Group, which is a coalition of around 50 different community organizations working on opening up the river and improving water quality. The BCEQ helps to organize an annual canoeing event on the river for area students, and they have also played a big role in an exciting project to daylight Tibbetts Brooks. Tibbetts Brook is a tributary of the Harlem River, and currently it flows underground into the New York City sewer system, which has contributed to a number of problems such as flooding and lots of sewage getting flushed into the Harlem River during storms. Opening Tibbert Brooks to the sun, once again, would help to solve those problems while also creating more green space. This is one of the many exciting and long-running projects potentially happening along the river. Because this event was intended to be a real physical walk, we've tried to recreate as much of that experience digitally as possible. So while you'll be hearing from each of us in detail, as if we'd stop, discuss a specific location, we've also tried to intersperse these stops with some breaks, or you're simply taking something in as if you were walking on the tour. Also, though we ended up using this webinar format that is slightly less interactive, because of the number of people here, it does have a question and answer format, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. We will have time to discuss some of your questions near the end of this event. We're thrilled that so many of you wanted to be a part of this experiment, and I hope that you will be in touch to contribute your own experience and expertise as we set about bringing the history of the Harlem River to, well, everyone. So let's begin. First, I'm going to show you a map of the river so we can get our bearings. So here's the Harlem River. Here's Upper Manhattan. Here's the Bronx. I'm going to zoom in here. Here's Randall's Island, the East River. The Bronx Kill, those of you that listen to the oral history, this is where the swimming took place. Fresh Direct, La Mirada. Bridges. We're going up past Roberto Clemente Park. And here we are at the Marble Hill 225th Street stop, which is where our tour / walk would have begun if we had been doing this in person. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and this is right on the Harlem River. Right here, you can see, oh, we're actually sort of on the boat here. Anyways, one of the issues that we would have had if we had done this tour in person is that it would have been very loud, because we have Broadway right here, and above Broadway on the bridge is the 1 train. We also have the Metro North here. So it would have been difficult sometimes for you to hear us. We don't have to worry about that, but it's worth thinking about some of the sounds that we would have heard otherwise. And I'm going to zoom out for a moment and see if we can follow our tracks a little bit. So the title of this walk was and is Disconnected River. And one of the things that you'll see is if we had actually done this river, and this is an area with relatively good access and parks, is that we would have started out here, Marble Hill, we would have had our noisy meeting on the bridge here, and then we would have spent a long time just walking and walking past the hospital, past the Columbia playing fields before we would have gotten back to the river. And then we would have probably stopped right here at Muscata Marsh. This is the site of the neighborhood Sealy. I used to do that with my son. I don't think anyone has actually spotted Sealy this season, unfortunately. And we would have walked sort of all through here before concluding our tour. You can see Columbia Sea there, and you can also see on the map, it says Sputendievel Creek. And so you may be wondering, why doesn't it say the Harlem River? Well, let me explain. So we're going to go to the one stop for all your river history, riverhistories.org. And we're going to click on the rivers, Harlem River. Some of you had a chance to view this historical story map beforehand, but I want to focus on this map here. And this is a map of Manhattan, of the Harlem River from 1865. And it's overlaid in red here with the current course of the river. And you can see that the current Harlem River looks very different than the old Harlem River, and particularly around this area here around Marble Hill, where the Harlem River kind of petered out right here, and then Sputendievel Creek came up through there. And now the Harlem River actually flows on this side of Marble Hill. So the piece that was once in Manhattan is now in the Bronx, although technically it is still a part of Manhattan, though it's on the other side of the river. And one of the things, so this was created in the late 19th century, this new route for the Harlem River. And a lot of people have told me, well, the Harlem River isn't really a river, it's a canal. It was created, it's a man-made river, it's not a river. And I would argue that's kind of a misleading term, because for one thing, we could really say that about any river. You know, all rivers are a product of people and the environment, and we're a part of that. Those of you, a number of you mentioned that you have gone boating on the river as rowers or canoers. If you've ever felt the strength of the current and the tides while you're paddling on the river, you know that that's not something that's simply created by humans. That's something that's a real force that we have to contend with. That's maybe one wouldn't say the word natural, but more importantly, you know, every river has been influenced by human beings, and this is particularly clear and obvious to many people today because of climate change, right? If the most basic thing that a river does is flood from rainfall, and climate change has had a huge effect on when and where rain falls in the world, then no river can be said to be sort of absent that, even if, you know, it's way off the map somewhere. So I think it's, you know, worth thinking about the ways in which this is a natural river in its own right. And that doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of things that could be restored, and that we can't do a lot of work to make it a healthier place for everyone and everything that lives along it. But it's worth thinking about the language we use when describing this place. The other thing I want to point out is thinking about, you know, what a river is and whether it's an amenity or a liability. So here we see the river on the Harlem River with the train yard, and then we can go over here, and here we see the Hudson River with parks and parkways, and the extent to which people have proposed, you know, even getting rid of the Harlem River altogether, whereas, you know, no one would ever suggest that for the Hudson River. But in particular, I want to point out a dichotomy here about history, which is that people describe the Hudson River as a very important river, important to our nation's history. They talk about the Hudson River School from the 19th century, or in the 20th century, a lot of the big environmental battles that were led by people like Pete Seeger. And yeah, there's a lot of great important history that took place along the Hudson River, but the same is true for the Harlem River, that there's history here that's worth learning about and that matters. And so that's what we're here to do. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to have our first interlude with Nathan.
Hey everyone, I just unmuted myself. Can you hear me now? I'm Nathan Kensinger. Thanks so much for having me. And I'm going to be speaking a little bit later, but for now, I'm going to be sharing a sort of a brief interlude that'll show some scenes from the Harlem River up close and personal, along with some of the sounds you might hear on certain parts of the Harlem River. We're going to be listening to sounds recorded at Inwood's North Cove, which is one of the sort of more natural little pockets along the coast of Inwood in Manhattan. So I'm just going to start that, and let's see, we'll sit and enjoy a little bit of the sights and sounds. All right. So yeah, that was just a little taste of some of the things you might have seen if you took a walk along the Harlem River. And now I'm gonna pass it along actually to Dwayne, who's gonna talk a bit more about the history of the river.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. Um, First, I want to just thank Scott for helping to organize this incredible event, and of course Columbia University for sponsoring Scott and sponsoring this program. And I'm delighted to be with Nathan again at the shared space. I've been following Nathan for many years, reading his articles in Curbed, and to be in this shared space with him together again tonight is a great, great honor. So thank you all for making this possible. So I guess I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So as was discussed earlier by Scott, this discussion is about the discussion between the Harlem River, and we're going to get into that a lot today. But I want to also kind of talk more about kind of reconnecting it, and using kind of images that kind of tie us to a past when, in many senses, kind of people were more intimate with the river, and it was kind of a more vibrant culture that was very, very clear through images, especially. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But I want to start with a quote here, which is about Alfred Kazan. All bridges, if they are well built, have their own beauty. They recall the passageway that is perhaps the most enduring symbol of life. They speak of the journey across, and they mark the limits within which we must live. At the same time, there is something given to us by others in which we cross. For we never entirely are alone, and we always rest on some base of human ingenuity provided by others. The essential theme of this quote obviously is about connection, right? Bridges are a means of connecting, both physically and creatively. And of course, the river that these bridges span also are about connection as well. So I want to, as I mentioned before, again, spend a lot of my talk trying to use images, some of my own as well as others, to connect to this past. I want to show through these digital documents from the late 19th and early 20th centuries how people at the time saw these spans as not only structures which they used to get from point A to point B, of course, but also as touristic landmarks and subjects of artistic inspiration as well. So, of course, many of you know this span here, the Highbridge, the crown jewel, I would argue, right, of the Harlem River bridges, the oldest surviving bridge in New York City. And notably, as some of you might know, this year the bridge had a bit of anniversary. It's 5 years since it was restored and opened to the public. But also it turned 172 years this summer, actually last month. Here's some more images. These are all that I've taken. So I have been working on the Harlem River for about 12 years. I've been documenting these spans and learning about them in the process, the spans themselves, but also the neighborhoods and communities that they bridge the river. Having born and raised in the Bronx, as Scott knows, I, for a long time, didn't really know the neighborhood communities in which I was a part of. But through this project, over a number of years, over 12 years actually, I got to really kind of see my neighborhood and Manhattan also in a really surprising and interesting way, in a really revealing way, in a way that I did not, that I had not imagined, and become a great love of mine. And so, again, one of the iconic spans that I've worked on and others is, of course, the Highbridge. Like Scott, I wanted to sort of show you a map here. It's really important. Maps are really important for giving context, right, for the landscape that we're going to look at. And people are surprised to know that there are 15 bridges that cross the Harlem River. Most of these people can drive across or walk across, but there are a few that one cannot. So it's a mix of both vehicular, pedestrian, and rail bridges. And again, starting from the very top of this, the Rhode Island Bridge goes again from Reynolds Island all the way upwards to Inwood and Spite and Dival, ending with the Spite and Dival swing bridge, which is the Amtrak bridge that you might know about. These are a couple of my images as well that I wanted to share, kind of giving that bird's eye view of the map. I thought also it'd be kind of great to kind of see this landscape, to see this river, to see these bridges from the air as well, and then put them in context. A lot of my work is, part of my work is about, you know, these bridges kind of being on the periphery of the large iconic bridges that we know of, the Washington Bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge, and many others. And so some of these aerial shots here, I'm kind of emphasizing that sort of peripheral view here of looking, in this case here, looking at Manhattan in the distance. Not only the bridges themselves, but thinking about the communities, right, that these bridges connect. Another view here, looking at the Broadway Bridge. It's just by Columbia University's field and Inwood. A little further up in the center of the frame is University Heights Bridge, and of course, Manhattan in the distance. Another, if we move a little further west, another great shot, again, looking south, the Henry Hudson Bridge and the Swindler Cove in the foreground, and the W Bridge in the far right center field, Hudson River, of course, as well. And of course, this shot here, again, get a really sense of how many bridges there are and how close they are to one another as well, which is something not as easy to see from the ground. One of the inspirations for that, for those aerial shots was this lithograph from 1882. This is my favorite print that I've found of the period. And again, you see here all these bridges here, one after the other. And surprisingly, actually, the Highbridge in the very distance there actually is the only surviving bridge that remains back from 1882. Other ones are all gone. So here again, some other incredible prints here of the Highbridge from Harper's Weekly. I think these prints, and I'll show you more going forward, kind of really speak again to the interest, right, in the Highbridge and of course the river that this bridge and the many others nearby it arose in the people in New Yorkers at the time period. As you might know, many people traveled uptown as an escape, right, from the bustling, crowded center of Manhattan at the time period. And so these images sort of reflect that escape and desire for touristic activities at the time period. It's a really cool artifact here, again, speaking to the centrality of the Harlem River and bridges in the early 20th century, late 19th. This postcard, right, of New York landmarks, we can recognize all of these here. Surprisingly, the Highbridge is one of the places on this postcard. I mean, who would have thunk, right, that the Highbridge would be actually a destination in a postcard? But again, it's a really telling artifact, right? It speaks to, again, this popular interest in the bridge as a destination, as a landmark, as a site, worthy enough of buying it, right? And maybe, again, sending it to relatives or friends who might live elsewhere. It's another beautiful postcard, again, of the period, right? Again, showing, again, the Highbridge and the Washington Bridge behind it and the Highbridge Tower. Also of note here is this wonderful detail in the lower left corner of the oars and the boathouse, which again speaks to, as I'll get to in a minute here, about the Harlem River as a place of recreational use, right? Again, of connecting it to this past. Another unique artifact here, again, speaking to the popularity of the Highbridge and the river, is this puzzle. Who would have thought there would be a puzzle made of the Highbridge? But again, that speaks to, again, the interest in this incredible destination, again, escape from Midtown, but also the environment around it is very, very bucolic and verdant, and again, lush scenery that would be an escape from the hustle and bustle and the crowds of lower Manhattan. Going back, as many of you know, again, at the Harlem River as a recreational space, there's some incredible lithographs and prints that document that incredible history, where, again, boat clubs and rowing associations would compete on the Harlem River. And of course, the bridges as being important backdrops to these competitions. And also in terms of recreation, also thinking about sports as well, right? Of course, the iconic Polo Grounds was located right beside the Harlem River at 155th Street. And here's a wonderful image of the old Polo Grounds. And you can see very faintly in the distance on the right, the arches of the Highbridge in the distance. There's another great shot a little bit later here of the Polo Grounds on the right and the Harlem River Drive leading to what is today the main drive and the Highbridge and the Highbridge Tower in the distance. And also for baseball lovers here and just fans of the Harlem River as well, not only was the Polo Grounds, of course, very close to the Harlem River, but also Yankee Stadium, right? Both of these iconic ballparks were not only neighbors, but also they were neighbors of the Harlem River. And so we have here again, this intimate connection, right? Not only to recreational history, but also sports history in America and in New York. This is one of my favorite images here by Henry Jackson, who's probably best known for his images of the American West and of Native Americans. Again, he came and took some time to document this really wonderful, beautiful view of the Harlem River and, of course, the High Bridge and the Washington Bridge back in the 1890s. What's incredible is that there are not only artists who, use their talents and skills for a commercialism and for journalistic endeavors, but also there were a number of rather well-known artists, painters notably, who spent a lot of time in the Harlem River documenting this part of New York City. And Ernest Lawson's perhaps the not really well-known today, but definitely of his time, he's probably the most famous and a prolific painter of the Harlem River. This is one of his beautiful images here from 1913. Other artists of the period were focused on the commercial, industrial grittiness that the Harlem River was often used for back in the early part of the 20th century, like Joseph Pinnell and also George Lukes. A lot of that commerce actually, of course, is no longer there, but these images sort of speak to a time when the river was far more used for industrial purposes than it might be today. And Edward Hopper, the great painter, also spent some time up in Manhattan, the Bronx, documenting, again, the river and at least this bridge here, the McCombs Dam Bridge at 155th Street. So, my work is, I show those images to remind us that, while there aren't, well, my body of work is on the Harlem River, and I've been working that exclusively for the past 12 years, that my work is not out of nowhere, right? That there's a long sort of history that I think is sort of not really well known by most people of earlier artists, journalists, and others who were fascinated by the bridges, as I am today, right, that span this river, but also the river itself and what it means, and the communities and landscapes that it bridges. And so my work is part of a continuum that again connects both past and present. And so one of the challenges that I'm sure Nathan will probably mention in his talk as a photographer is, again, access to the Harlem River, right? It's not as easy as one might imagine, as some of you know. And especially on the Bronx side, the Manhattan side actually is much better. But on the Bronx side in particularly, there are a lot of obstructions to actually touching the water itself. And as a photographer, one has to try and finesse and find sort of those crevices as best one can to kind of overcome those barriers to the waterfront. So this one here's from Randall's Island here. This one here's from Bridge Park, right below the Alexander Hamilton Bridge. And of course, Inwood Hill Park and the famous Columbia Sea on the Sea Rock in the distance. And this is the last bridge, again, it's Untitled Bridge, the Amtrak bridge, the last in the 15, going from south to north that, that spans the Harlem River. So I think with that, I'll conclude.
Great. Thank you, Dwayne.
Sure.
Okay, so we're going to go on a little boat tour now. When my students and I were in our river history course, one of the things we did was we went on a Circle Line boat tour. And so the Circle Line boat tour is on the classic New York City tourist things you can do there. It circumnavigates Manhattan on the Hudson, East, and Harlem rivers. So the day that we actually were going to go on the tour, the first thing they told us when we got on the boat was that we actually weren't going to go on the Harlem River, which was disappointing, but not surprising. However, we did end up going on the river, and as actually the bridge that we just went under in the video, we must have come within an inch or half an inch of touching it. So there was actually a more valid reason for their hesitation going all the way up the Harlem River. But nonetheless, when we did get to the Harlem River, that's when the tour narration stopped and he took his break. So now that you've all been on this walk, next time that happens, you can go pick up the microphone and pick up where he left off. I think one of the things that was most surprising to me and my students was that the whole tour isn't about the water at all. You're looking up at the Empire State Building, you're looking at some celebrity's penthouse, and we're on the water, why not mention it and talk about it, rather than just focus on the skyline the whole time. But one of the things that's we're thinking about too is that someday that skyline may well be the water line. So we'll have to think about it more eventually, but why not now? So anyways, here we are floating along the river. That's the Metro North line there, and that's the Broadway Bridge behind us. Up on mapping. All right, I'm going to hand this over to Nathan.
Thank you. Yeah, hi everyone. It's great to have so many people here on this virtual walk today. My name is Nathan Kensinger, as I mentioned before, and I've been exploring New York City's waterfront for the last 17 years. And the Harlem River has always been one of my favorite places to walk around and to photograph. So I'm happy to be sharing some of my experiences today with you. I'm going to share my screen now so we can look at some of my photographs that I've taken of the Harlem River over the years. Let's see. Great. Can you guys see my screen, Scott and Dwayne? Excellent. So for the last 14 years, I've been writing and I've written and photographed more than 260 photo essays about New York City's changing waterfront. And one of my ongoing projects as part of that body of work has been to hike or to canoe along every river and creek in the city. There's over 30 above ground rivers left in New York, and so far I've researched and documented about 24 of them. So many of these rivers are very difficult to access, and they're hidden in some of the most remote parts of the city, behind fences and walls and other barriers. In 2018, the New York Times did a profile about my project, and I shared this because I liked the subheadline that they wrote, actually. It says, "Some of New York's scenic byways are navigable only by canoe, but if you're willing to brave the ticks, poison ivy, and potential teenage makeout spots, the vistas are something else." I first started photographing the Harlem River about 15 years ago, and I've gone on to write maybe half a dozen different photo essays about it, many of them published at Curb, New York. This piece was 2014 about the Harlem River's rebirth, which actually led to Dwayne and I doing an exhibit about the Harlem River and some of the new spaces that were opening along the Harlem River. At this point, I think I've explored almost the entire coastline on both sides of the Harlem River, including many of its fenced off areas. And what I've come to find is that the Harlem River is actually a pretty neglected but fascinating body of water. Although it borders some very crowded neighborhoods in Manhattan and the Bronx, it's quite difficult to access, and the communities on both sides of the river are cut off from the shoreline, both by the geography of the river, being down in a valley, or by the highways, the train lines, the industry, and the municipal facilities that line the shore. This lack of public access has a long history going back more than 100 years and is tied to the Harlem River's use as an industrial center and a transportation hub. The river is about 8 miles long, so it has approximately 16 miles of shoreline in the Bronx and in Manhattan. But however, there's currently maybe just 4 places in the Bronx that I know of where the public can legally get to the water, and only 8 places in Manhattan that I know of. On the Bronx side of the river, almost 5 miles of shoreline are completely cut off from the public. Even areas that are open to the public can be difficult to find. And to the north, the shoreline that we're seeing here is blocked by the Metro North train line, and also by a CSX freight train line and the Major Deegan Expressway. Further south in the Bronx, the train tracks cut off pretty much the whole shoreline of the Bronx River. The Bronx's side of the Harlem River is really lined with rail yards and storage warehouses and parking lots and concrete plants. What we're seeing here is another freight train line further down close to Mott Haven. The lack of waterfront access and green space is really huge environmental justice for these communities in the Bronx, which have very few parks and very high rates of asthma due to all of the air pollution caused by these transportation networks. On the Manhattan side of the Harlem River, much of the southern shoreline is near East Harlem and is also cut off by another transportation route. This is the Harlem River Drive, which hugs the shoreline for 100 blocks and is another source of air pollution for the communities there. Along much of the waterfront here, you have, as you can see, a very narrow strip of either park or walkway that's been left open to the public, but it's sandwiched really between a highway and the river and is quite difficult to access. This is another view showing sort of the difficulty of that access, that you really have to go over a complicated system of overpasses and pathways to get to the river on the Manhattan side here. This is looking out from Highbridge Park across the Harlem River and across the Harlem River Drive. The Highbridge, of course, is a huge park that's right next to the river, but doesn't have any access that goes directly to the water and is pretty much completely cut off from the Harlem River. Further to the north in Inwood, the waterfront is predominantly cut off by a variety of municipal facilities. There's an MTA train yard, there's bus depots and sanitation warehouses and a power plant, as well as parking lots and the ball fields of Columbia University, which all cut off access to the waterfront. But what's been most interesting to me through my own explorations of the river is seeing how the surrounding communities have sought to connect to the Harlem River, even in places that have little or no public access. In the Bronx, fishermen have found a number of places to cast their lines along the river, like this fisherman named Freddie, who was out on a concrete ramp near the Highbridge. According to Freddie, you could catch porgy and eels and flounder and blues and catfish and toadfish and striped bass in the river. And he'd also caught some really nice crabs, which he had jumped into the river to fish out. Over in Manhattan, there's a whole series of elaborate fishing platforms that have been set up by community members behind the fenced off shoreline of Inwood. One of the fishing spots that was built even had like carpets and chairs and cooking stoves and a spice rack set up so people could just fry up their fresh catch right there. I'd say Inwood is really one of the last wild, undeveloped sections of Manhattan's coastline, and the community there has found their own ways to access the waterfront. One example of that, a great example of that, is at Inwood's North Cove, where we heard the sound earlier in the walk. At Inwood's North Cove, there's been a team of volunteers led by James Cataldi, who have been working for years to clean up what was a really neglected inlet next to the MTA train yard in Inwood, and to turn it into a natural area. This was once an illegal dumping ground, but now they've recorded over 70 different species here in the Cove, including 45 types of birds that have stopped by on migrations, as well as mussels and clams and oysters and possums and muskrats. Besides these informal spaces that community members have made, there's also a number of large parks that have been built along the shoreline of the Harlem River. These include Inwood Hill Park, Highbridge Park, Roberto Clemente State Park, and the ball fields of Randall's Island. But in many of these older parks, access to the water is still very limited, and the river is mostly a fenced-off backdrop, where the public is allowed to look at the water from a safe distance, but definitely not like touch the water or swim in the water or boat in the water. What's been interesting to me, though, is that in the last 15 years or so, there's been a number of smaller parks that have opened up, providing some really interesting new access to the water. These include the Sherman Creek parks, and we're seeing one of them here. There are a series of 5 small pocket parks that are on the dead-end streets of Inwood, and they opened in 2007. And what you're seeing here is actually it's the only canoe and kayak launch on the entire east coast of Manhattan. This is the only place that you can launch out on the east side of Manhattan into the Harlem River or even the East River. There's no other canoe or kayak launch that's been built. Another really interesting new park is Moscata Marsh, which is a 1-acre park that opened in 2014 at the northern tip of Manhattan. The park includes a restored saltwater marshland and a new freshwater wetlands, as well as another canoe and kayak launch where you can launch out into the northern tip of Manhattan and I suppose come around the corner and bike down to the Sherman Creek parks. Sorry, boat down. In the Bronx, there's Bridge Park, which opened in 2014 and which provides one of the only direct access points to the river in the Bronx. It's a park where there's no barriers to stop you from climbing down onto the rocky shoreline and going out into the water, which is pretty rare for a New York City park. I mean, most New York City parks, if you think about it, they've got a big fence that is discouraging you from doing this. And one of my own favorite new waterfront parks is actually on the Harlem River, which is Swindler Cove Park. They opened in 2003. It was created as a partnership between the city and the New York Restoration Project. And it's a tiny park, but is really, I describe it as kind of like a jewel box. It includes, as we're seeing here, one of the only public beaches on the coast of Manhattan. There's really few beaches that exist in Manhattan where you can go out on a sandy stretch and be close to the water. And besides its waterfront gardens and pathways, the park also includes a community garden, which is run by the local elementary school, and is also home to the Peter J. Sharp Boathouse, which was built with the idea that it would provide free access to rowing for local kids and for New York schools. Like many places along the coast of the Harlem River, Swindler Cove was also used as a dumping ground for illegal waste for many years, including like abandoned cars and household waste. The cleanup here cost almost $10 million to complete. And up until just a few years ago, the coastline was home to a collection of abandoned houseboats that had also been allowed to sink into the river. That's what we saw earlier in the slideshow that I shared. And today the coastline is really one of the few places in all of Manhattan, at the coastline at Swindler Cove, that is one of the few places in Manhattan where you can sit right at the water's edge underneath a canopy of trees. And if you wanted to, you could walk right out into the river and go for a swim. In reality, though, the Harlem River is far from being a swimmable or even safely fishable waterway. The river has been heavily polluted by a century of industry, and it's also tainted by New York City's antiquated combined sewer system. Every year, 1.9 billion gallons of raw sewage mixed with rainwater is dumped out into the river. According to a 2014 article in Conservation Magazine, they said the Harlem River briefly turns into an unflushed toilet whenever a lot of rain comes down. And though the city is required by law to clean the river, by the Clean Water Acts, they're required to clean the Harlem River. The Department of Environmental Protection announced earlier this year that they've decided not to adopt any plan to clean up the problem of sewage overflows here, and may in fact be increasing the amount of sewer overflows by another 3 million gallons. Another challenge that's facing the river is sea level rise and climate change. A recent report by the New York City Panel on Climate Change predicted that New York is facing a sea level rise of between 1.25 and 9.5 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century, which is just a catastrophic amount, no matter like what level it is. Along the Harlem River, there's numerous communities and parks that would be inundated permanently by that amount of sea level rise. Hurricane Sandy gave us a precursor to what that might look like. According to an article in DNA Info, during Sandy on the Bronx side, there was 3 feet of flooding recorded at the Roberto Clemente State Park, and that caused great damage to the bulkhead there, which took years to repair. And in Manhattan, homes near the Inwood shoreline saw flooding when Sherman Creek overflowed, with water flowing across 10th Avenue and into the New York City Housing Authority's Dyckman houses, filling the lobbies of the buildings at West 202nd Street and 10th Avenue. According to one resident there, the water was knee-deep inside the building lobby and hip-deep outside. I'm going to end with this cheery piece of graffiti from the Highbridge that I found in Highbridge Park, which reads, "One day it will all fall into the river." And ultimately, I feel that this is probably true because erosion and flooding and sea level rise are all slowly chipping away at everything that we built along the Harlem River. I mean, the bulkheads, the shoreline. It's water is a nonstop force that is constantly going to be chipping away at everything we do. And the Harlem River having such a huge tidal shift every day causes, daily destruction where it takes out sand and rocks and concrete. So in that light, I really think it's interesting to think about some of the recent proposals that have come up to rezone the Harlem River and to build new apartment towers right at the edge of its water. There's a proposal in Inwood to rezone the waterfront and build towers right at the water's edge that would have destroyed Inwood's North Cove and also all of those local fishing holes. And in Mott Haven, there's a new development called Bankside, which is theoretically going to put 1,350 apartments right at sea level next to the edge of the water. I think, while it's great that the city has started to finally recognize the unique shoreline of the Harlem River, I wonder if right now is the best time to move thousands of new residents to the water's edge, just as the water is beginning to rise.
So one of the, find the slide here. Up there it is. Okay. All right, great. Okay. So for the interlude period here, I wanted to focus on an area that I found recently that I found to be quite magical. It was wonderful kind of hearing the noises, hearing the bustling earlier in today's presentation. You might get the impression that it's really hard to find sort of little areas where you kind of feel like you're by yourself in New York City. And there are a couple of places like that I found along the Harlem River. And one of them is this little alcove or little beach that's in Inwood Hill Park. And I'd seen images taken from it a while back and finally kind of made my way and actually found it. And you kind of do a bit of a trek to get into kind of the depth of the forest in Inwood. but there is actually a path that leads to this spot. And so it's one area where you're right by the Spot and Dival Bridge, and it's right where the Hudson and the Harlem Rivers meet. And so I'm in Manhattan from this vantage point here. In the distance, opposite part of the bridge is a Spot and Dival. That's the Bronx over there. And so the Amtrak bridge crosses the bridge here. And if you know, a little further up is, of course, the Metro North train on the Hudson line that travels in that direction. And I remember going there actually maybe 2 weeks ago, and people were in the park. It was a warm, warm summer day, noise and music and commotion, people having fun. And when you get into the park, all of that noise began to kind of just die out. And then when you got to this one little corner of the park on the beach, no more. And it was as if in all the bustle, all the energy of all the people there in New York City, it was kind of a place of respite and a place of escape, and a place that, at least for a few moments, I could kind of say is my own. That was pretty awesome. And at the same time, to see this incredible structure and the trains going by it, going across it, and also, an occasional craft or, going under the bridge as well. So it's a pretty cool spot. So, so yeah. Thank you, Scott.
All right, thank you, Nathan and Dwayne. So now we're going to sort of have a brief discussion among the three of us, sort of thinking about reconnecting with the river. And so, how can we use this information here to think about what will bring people back to the river and make the place more accessible for the people who live there now. And Dwayne, I really like your point of just about the postcard, about how people 100 years ago viewed the river as a site worth visiting when you were coming to New York City. And a lot's changed since then, but maybe there's something there. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. Thank you, Scott. I think the Highbridge restoration 5 years ago, I think, was a really important step in that direction. I think the way in which they restore the bridge to remind people of the bridge's history, but also the history of the area. And by that, I mean, for those of you who have walked across it, you might recall that there are these large medallions that are across the breadth or the length of the bridge, and they sort of chronicle the history of the structure, what it was used for originally, it being an aqueduct, to it being a spot where, again, tourists and locals came to enjoy a break from, the crowds of Manhattan. So I think one thing might be trying to see how things like the Highbridge, I think how that was so successful at the ways in which it went about, I think, reminding people of the history, putting in context. And I would imagine too, maybe other sort of posters or signs along the waterfront or nearby these spans that might kind of just, again, remind people about this history that might not be obvious, again, because many of these places don't have any such signage or post.
Okay. So I actually want to go ahead and start answering some of the questions that people have had, because I think it will help us think through some of these things. And one is also sort of, it's not just a question, is the Hudson River was also from Miriam. The Hudson River is also inaccessible and inviting, but runs through different neighborhoods, class differences. And so I think this also gets to another question that I can also answer, which is thinking about when a river becomes a liability versus an amenity, and then often is reflective of the people who live there and how they're treated within the city and what kind of political power they have. Because another question from Phil is, what is the environmental ecological health of the Harlem River? I'm curious how it compares to the East River and the Hudson. And so the, I guess I would say part of the answer is, well, on one level, the water quality is similar. A lot of the river in the Harlem River comes from the Hudson, which is a Superfund site with lots of PCBs, but the Harlem River, I couldn't tell you exactly how the water quality compares with the Hudson River, on a gram by gram basis of the E. coli. But I will say that there are specific things about what flows into the Harlem River that do make it particularly, if not exceptionally polluted. And those are sort of the ways in which neighborhoods, especially in the Bronx, don't have a lot of green space. And so you have a lot more runoff going directly into the river than you would have otherwise. And there's a number of organizations that are working on fixing this, both sort of for water quality. There's a lot of different benefits that happen when you start thinking about, it's not just that we're going to have a park, but it's also that we're going to clean up the environment. And these things kind of go hand in hand. And Tibbetts Brook is a great example of that. I mentioned this earlier, but Tibbetts Brook used to be a stream that just flowed basically from Van Cortlandt Park into the Harlem River, and now it's just funneled underground into a sewer. And so when it rains, all that water flowing from what was once Tibbetts Brook and all this sewage in the area flows directly into the Harlem River. And if the stream itself is converted into a living stream again that's opened up with green space, that's also going to be having a huge effect on the water quality by bringing the stream water directly into the river and leaving the sewage to go to the sewage treatment plants. Nathan, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, for looking at both of those questions, I was going to mention it in my talk, but I didn't because of time. But when you compare the Harlem River with the other side, the direct shoreline on the opposite side of Manhattan, on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, there really is a pretty striking difference. Along the Harlem River, there's a great lack of access. The parks are certainly not as well maintained, and also the parks themselves are much narrower. I mean, on the Manhattan side, you've got like Riverside Park. What other ones? There's several like excellent parks that extend really deep inland and give you this access where you can go, over the like covered tracks of the Amtrak line and down to the water. But on the Harlem River side, it's really inaccessible. And I do think part of that is geography, but part of it is certainly the communities on either side of Manhattan there, and the communities in the Bronx. Highbridge Park is one of the kind of, in parts, one of the most neglected parks in New York City, or certainly in Manhattan. And Riverside Park, which is just directly opposite it, is a much different situation in very good condition. So that even there's inequality even amongst the green spaces and how they're treated by the city. And in terms of the health of the water, I think that, in terms of like treating combined sewer overflow, the city's plan to deal with like the sewage overflows that go into the waters around Manhattan, the only place that they were going to correct sewage overflows was in Riverside Park. And they decided that by doing that, they would allow 3 million gallons of sewage overflows to go into the Harlem River. So, I mean, that's kind of a telling choice where they decided not to address any of the raw sewage problems on the Harlem River, but they decided to address the raw sewage problems happening in Riverside Park. You can draw your own conclusions from that, I suppose. There were no plans to deal with any raw sewage overflows on the Bronx side of the river at all. So it's interesting to look at how different communities are treated by the city.
So this question is from Libby, directed to Dwayne. What inspires you most about the river, Dwayne? You keep coming back to it as a subject of your work.
Wow. I guess one thing is, that, as we've been discussing, that there's still so much to learn about this body of water, right? Again, as someone who was born and raised essentially blocks away from it, and how little I knew about it for most of my life, and then only, in the past 12 years, more or less, how I'm kind of rediscovering a part of my community and learning and growing from that and making new connections. And so I think that curiosity that, I have, I think is kind of what brings me back to it, and to try and make better images and better work. And then I think knowing, as we discussed, I think knowing, how this body of water and the spans that cross it are part of something longer, and kind of also enjoying that we're kind of all telling a story that has not been told very often. That I find really exciting, that we kind of have this little sort of history that we're trying to get out there, and to let people be proud and be more aware of this fascinating part of New York City. And so I think that really drives me to share that awesome history. Yeah.
Great. All right, so next we have a question about swimming. So it's dangerous, how dangerous? I know you've both seen quite a few people who have swum in the river.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you can certainly swim in the Harlem River. There's nothing to say you should not swim in the Harlem River. I would say, personally, I probably would not swim in the waterways around New York City after it rained, when the most raw sewage is released into the water. But if you were to get in the water, on a nice sunny day, not anytime near a rainstorm, you probably would find the water quality to be not too bad. I mean, it's a mixture of seawater from the East River and a mixture of Hudson River water coming down. So, depending on the time and what's been released upstream, you could find it to be a very pleasant place to go swimming. What I meant by saying it was not actually a swimmable river is that under the Clean Water Act, it's required to be a place that the public is allowed to swim in like year round, no matter what, like not to have any days where it's so polluted that you shouldn't touch the water. And currently there are days when you really should not be out on any of the waterways around New York City because of this problem of raw sewage. But yeah, people swim all the way around Manhattan, in circumnavigations, and I certainly know people who swim in the Hudson and the East River. So yeah.
All right, so we have a question from two different people who want to learn about Robert Moses. So Robert Moses is this famous / infamous city planner, most powerful person in New York City's history, who was never elected to office. What role does he play in enforcing inequality along the river?
Yeah, I'm seeing a question here that says, how much of the river's inaccessibility can be attributed to Robert Moses and his wrong-headed master plan for the city and its environs? Which is interesting. Of course, Robert Moses shaped the city that we all live in, for better or for worse. And I would say, certainly there's a lot of examples on the Harlem River that might be for the worse, and around Manhattan and around all of the city, where you have roads built right up to the water's edge that were meant to give drivers the access to the water as parkways, as opposed to thinking about how humans might be able to actually go out and be on the water and enjoy the waterfront. But if you look at the Harlem River and other parts of Manhattan, it's a mixture. Of course, Riverside Park is not on the Harlem River, but Riverside Park is an example of a Robert Moses project where he decided to cover over the train lines and allow people to go, instead of having a train line cutting them off, to go out to the water's edge by playing on top of the train tracks, or by going down to the other side of the train tracks and getting to the Hudson River. So that was a vision he had that some would argue is a positive outcome. It'd be great if you could cover over the Harlem River Drive, next to Highbridge Park, or even further south in East Harlem, and allow people to get access up both above the Harlem River Drive and then go down to the water's edge. But yeah, definitely a mixed bag. Robert Moses created a lot of inaccessibility, while the thinking was that you were actually creating accessibility at the time. Accessibility for cars and buses and trucks, but not accessibility for humans.
Great. So then we had one question about organizations to join, or activism on behalf of Bronx River Health and Access especially. So the two groups that I mentioned at the beginning, the Bronx Council on Environmental Quality and also the South Bronx Unite, which played a big role in trying to prevent some of the development that cut off access to rivers, such as the Fresh Direct Depot that's there now. So those are two organizations. I don't know if there's other ones that you two.
Yeah, I mentioned the New York Restoration Project that has been working with Swindler Cove and Sherman Creek, but they're also doing work in Mott Haven to try and restore a strip of the shoreline near the Bronx Kill. So they hold volunteer cleanups. They also do cleanups in Highbridge Park, where they maintain part of Highbridge Park. So I've gone out with them and like pulled weeds and helped clear out the vines that are choking out parts of Highbridge Park. So that's also a good organization that does like a lot of hands-on work, really getting out into these areas and like literally pulling out trash. And also I mentioned the folks at Inwood's North Cove, and that's an organization too, where you can literally just go and pull trash out of the Harlem River and see the effects of your work almost immediately.
All right. What about the river as a transportation route? I mean, I've been on the Circle Line. What else have you seen about people using the river for transportation?
Well, I'm obviously now, of course, during the summertime, see a lot of people with pleasure craft up and down the river, you know, jet skis or pleasure boats, which is awesome. And yeah, I mean, like, very rare you see anything larger than a pleasure craft on the Harlem River these days. That's very, very rare. I mean, these, you know, the bridges, of course, are built to move, and you know, many of them are, but that doesn't happen too often. Yeah, aside from trains and cars and bicycling across some of these, I'm quite sure about boats. Nathan, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was originally like rerouted and straightened and dredged to allow more shipping traffic to go through it. But today, honestly, you can go out on the river and like not see a boat pass by for quite some time. I personally, I'm trying to think if I've ever seen a tugboat or a barge. I looked through like the thousands of photographs I've taken there, and I don't think I saw a tugboat myself. But you do see, because of that quietness on the river and it no longer being used as this kind of like boating transportation space, you do see a lot of people using it for recreational use. A lot of jet skis. I mean, you got this largely empty and quiet stretch of water, so people are zipping up and down on jet skis and other kinds of fishing boats. But yeah, the industrial use of the water by boats is something that I think has faded away. It's not a lot of businesses right on the shoreline that I can think of that have the need for like a barge or tugboat to haul in materials or take away waste.
Yeah, I can't think of one. There's actually, you know, there's a crane, which I'm assuming was probably used back when there was more industrial use along the waterfront. And it's this large crane at the 145th, where they have the large the park that is going to be transformed to the hip hop museum, I think maybe next year. And that land, there's this massive crane there, which I don't know what they're going to do with it, but it kind of has a look that maybe at one point that might have been used to transport maybe, you know, items from the shore onto boats before they built the rail link along the Harlem River. But aside from that, like massive crane. I can't think of much in terms of, old artifacts that kind of speak to an age of mass industrial use.
I mean, in a sense, the train along the Bronx side, the train lines really cut off the ability for boats to
Yeah,
use the Harlem River. You
true.
can't really launch a boat through the Metro North tracks in some places. And you can't, on the freight train tracks, as we saw in that one photo early on, you can't launch a boat. There's no gate on those freight train tracks that I know of that would allow a boat to go into a business there.
Right.
So it's these overlapping layers of transportation and freight and other things that have actually cut off other uses of the river, cut off the ability to put a boat into the water.
Okay, next question. So this is a big one. So I don't know, how can we think about this question specifically in relationship to the Harlem River, which is, what are New York City, New York State's plans for addressing rising sea levels in the next Sandy?
That's
yeah.
a big question. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would have to think about, honestly, I don't know of a specific plan to do a comprehensive protection, system along the Harlem River. There was a federal proposal that was from the United States Army Corps of Engineers that recently was kind of shot down and actually shelved. But it was a federal proposal that was going to be, it had several layers of suggestions that would deal with storm surge flooding caused by increased storms. And some of those proposals included putting gates at the mouths of many of the rivers around New York City. I think within that proposal, one of the ideas was to put shoreline-based measures along parts of the Harlem River, meaning like levees and walls that would stop storm surge from going inland into neighborhoods. But that federal proposal got shelved completely, and there is no large-scale plan that I know of that addresses sea level rise or storm surge for the entirety of New York City or for the entirety of the Harlem River. There are some smaller things in place that may happen on the Harlem River. Roberto Clemente State Park, has repaired its bulkhead and done a huge project to kind of try and create a more malleable shoreline that will allow water in a bit, and then also to protect from flooding in the future. But that's like that much of the shoreline along 16 miles of shoreline. So there may be a piecemeal approach, but I'm not aware of a large scale project for the Harlem River.
Yeah, same here. I'm not aware of any project as well.
Yeah, which is, to me, the fact that the federal proposal was flawed in its nature, but it was the only proposal that was out that was like, we're going to do a very large, project, or decide on some large project that could help solve some of these massive problems that are coming New York City's way. And without that, there really is not a comprehensive plan currently to deal with sea level rise in New York. We're kind of without a plan, and I don't know of any plans on the horizon to deal with sea level rise on the scale that is going to be needed.
Okay, so this is a great question. What happened to the creeks that were originally there draining the landscape? So Tibbetts Brook is one example of that. And if you can look at the map that I shared with you from the 19th century or even earlier ones, there are a lot of streams and things like that in New York City, and most of them are just a part of the sewer system now. Some of them have been resurrected. If you go to Yonkers, they've done a great job of daylighting the Sawmill River. It's really exciting the ways they've opened it up to the sunlight again. Nathan's done a lot of work on that.
Yeah, most of the rivers that were in Manhattan have been buried or routed into the sewer system. On the Bronx side of the Harlem River, I don't know of any above ground rivers that are extant that still flow into the Harlem River. But Tibbetts Brook, if it is daylighted, it currently, Tibbetts Brook flows above ground when it's in Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx, and then it hits this section of the park where it goes underground and disappears suddenly. But the idea is that it's going to be routed along this sort of abandoned train line that cuts all the way down to the Harlem River near that power plant that I showed a photo of earlier in my interlude. But it would enter, theoretically, it would enter the Harlem River just across from Inwood, next to this abandoned power plant that sits on CSX freight train property. And if that happens, it would be the first daylighting in New York City. The first daylighting meaning the first time that a buried river has been unearthed and brought back into light. It wouldn't flow along the original route of Tibbetts Brook. It would be flowing along this crazy abandoned train line next to a parkway. But it would be amazing to see that happen, and to see that water pumping out into the Harlem River. It's fresh water that's just, coursing through Van Cortlandt Park and through these lively natural areas before it just suddenly vanishes and becomes pumped out to the sewage system. So.
And Nathan, are there any concrete plans again yet to have that done, or?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah. So that actually, the city has committed, as far as I know, the city is committed to daylighting Tibbetts Brook. It was a New York City Parks Department project, but the DEP has signed off on it now too, as far as I know, and they're linking it in with that need to clean up the sewage overflows. So the DEP had this big project where they were supposed to clean up all the sewer overflows around the city, which, as I said, they decided not to do anything on the Harlem River, but they did throw their support behind the daylighting of Tibbetts Brook as a way to reduce some of the sewer overflows. So by taking that fresh water from Tibbetts Brook and rerouting it, they would be reducing the amount of fresh water that goes into the sewer system. So as far as I know, it knock on wood, it theoretically may be going forward. You've got the city agencies now in coordination. They have to, I don't know if they've acquired the property. They were negotiating with the property owners. That's part of the problem here on the Harlem River is, the property is owned by these various entities. To build a park even, it's like you have to negotiate, like, all right, like you've got the Department of Transportation that owns this little pocket. We've got the freight train that owns this pocket. How do we create a park out of this while also negotiating these complicated landscapes of trains and trucks and highways? So if the Parks Department and the city can acquire this abandoned train line, it would go forward. And it goes very close to another section of abandoned train line owned by CSX that's on the Bronx side that, if that was ever acquired, would easily become a new green space. It's this big, it's currently like a concrete plant across from Swindler Cove. And if you walk out into it, it's just this overgrown forested area that, has like these abandoned train lines running between the trees and is just not used much, not even by the concrete plant. So if the city could acquire some of these strange pockets of land and think creatively, there would be ways to create more green space on the Harlem River.
We have a comment, dilution isn't always the solution.
I'm guessing
And then
referring to Tibbetts Brook. Yeah, I mean, I don't think, dilution.
Solution to pollution is pollution, no, not necessarily.
Yeah.
And so we have our final question. This is for Dwayne from Ann. In thinking in sort of a comparative context here, have the bridges of any other city captured you to the same extent as New York City? Is there a Harlem River in Iceland or India? Or...
It's a great question, actually. Actually, not to date. It's funny, like when I go other places, I don't often think about bridges. I think about other things. So like, it's sort of funny, actually. I'm sure there are cities out there I know that have incredible bridge histories, Rome and London and other cities. But I have yet to dive into that. And maybe one day I will. But so far, the Harlem River is my love. So yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, folks, that's the end of our presentation of our walk. Hope you're well rested and that you enjoyed and took some things away from this. You can email us if you have any sort of feedback, and as we're thinking about this history more, and I will send out a link with a recording of of this event. And I will also, yeah, just want to hear from you sort of what this experience meant to you. And you can also check out riverhistories.org. So thank you so much, Dwayne and Nathan. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.